Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
My view of all of these things is really about how does this affect my clients. So I don't really focus on what's right and what's wrong, but rather on how does this affect my clients. And I guess this morning, if you were looking at things happening in the world, it's difficult to imagine, but something else has totally overtaken the whole coronavirus thing on the global stage, and that is the protesting and rioting in the United States. So maybe let me kick off with a comment about that. And my main comment would be, by far the biggest influence of these events is likely to be in terms of the presidential election in November, because that has a long-lasting effect. So typically what you see with riots is it doesn't have very good consequences for the police or the businesses involved in the places where you get these protests that turn into riots, and it also doesn't have very good consequences for the rioters. So there's not much productive that comes out of it in the short run, but it does influence politics. But who gets elected in a presidential election has some very long-lasting effects. So the actions that Donald Trump has taken over the last 4 years will have ramifications for the next 20 years in terms of global events. And so whoever gets elected in November will also have long-lasting effects. And the thing that you have to say is that the last time there were massive riots before a presidential election was in 1968. So after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there was massive rioting and burning and so on in the United States. And that actually had the effect that moderate people decided that they wanted some law and order. So the reason why you hear Trump saying, "I'm your law and order candidate," is he now wants those moderate people who do not partake in these type of events to say, "I'd rather have someone who restores order, please." And Richard Nixon got elected in 1968 rather than the Democratic candidate. So it played into the hands of the conservative candidate the last time this happened. It may work differently this time in the sense that there may be a lot of people who think that that there's a case for the frustration of the protesters, and that may bring some, let's say, enthusiasm to the ranks of the Democratic organizers. But on balance, one has to say that it's probably in Donald Trump's favor, all of the, especially the violence and the rioting. The protest is something slightly different, but when it turns into violence and rioting, it probably favors Donald Trump rather than Joe Biden. So what we have to say about the US presidential election is that although Joe Biden is ahead in the polls, that election at this stage is still too close to call. Let me move on to what's on our agenda for today. And the first thing I want to talk about is the South African side and the progress that we're seeing in the epidemic in South Africa. So what you see on your screens right now is the South African incidence of COVID-19 in April. So you can see that there was a significant flattening of that curve roughly at the point where the lockdown was instituted. Not 100% clear that it was caused by the lockdown, but nevertheless, there was kind of an initial sharp uptick and then a slowing of that of the curve. Then, if you looked at it again a month later, roughly in May, what you saw, and if you will now be seeing the 1st of June. The old picture is still on my screen. We'll come to it in a second. Should be coming up. Yeah, there you go. There's the new picture. You can see that we've got a clear exponential curve, leading to about 35,000 cases in South Africa. So what we've got in South Africa is that in spite of the measures taken through quite a strict lockdown for about 5 weeks, we'll get to what a really strict lockdown. Can I just ask the participants to mute their
Telstra, good morning.
Please?
Yeah, Telstra, good morning. Won't you mute your speaker?
Muted. Sorry, I thought I was muted. Let me speak. Let me mute it.
Thank you. So, a really strict lockdown in a developed country brings the cases down to very close to zero. What we see in South Africa is that in spite of a quite strict lockdown, we see that we've got a proper exponential curve. So this curve is probably a month or two later than it would have been. So if the government is to be taken seriously as to its initial assertion that the only reason for the lockdown was to allow them to prepare the medical facilities for the epidemic to come, then that lag was in place. But we are now seeing a proper expansion in the epidemic, and we're likely to see that epidemic spread very widely over the next month or two. What we said the last time we spoke 2 weeks ago is that it's unusual for people to know someone who's had the disease, never mind someone who has died of the disease. I'm now in a position to say, unfortunately, that I know someone personally that has died of the disease, and I also know personally some other people who has gotten ill. So there's certainly a strong progression of the illness through South African society, and we are likely, given the opening up that we've now had, we're likely to see that progressing very, very quickly. And the other comment that goes with it is to say that I see in an interview, President Ramaphosa has said that his scientific advisors has told him that it's not necessary to stay at level 3, that it was actually better to go to level 1 because the lockdown has become such a blunt instrument in terms of containing the virus that you should be taking other measures, but that lockdown is no longer effective. But because the World Health Organization has the advice is to come out of lockdown slowly at the end of the epidemic. Now, that advice is really for developed countries who have brought the disease under control in a specific area. Then you come out of it slowly. For us to come out of it slowly is just a confusion. So I think quite a confused reaction from the South African government. But one of the positive things we have to say is that the government, it looked for a moment as if they, just before going to level 3, they were going to revert to level 4 or 5 for basically all the major cities where the disease seems to be spreading the fastest, which would be a real tragedy, because what you actually end up having is you end up having the worst of both worlds. You end up destroying your economy and having a serious epidemic. I think in South Africa, we're pretty much on the edge of doing that already. We've already generated massive harm to our economy, and we have also, we're not going to prevent the epidemic from spreading through the country, but hopefully the preparation of medical facilities will be better. But I think the major challenge for us in South Africa is going to be to not go into stricter lockdown when the spread of the epidemic occurs, because it will be of very little use, and at the same time it will be extremely damaging to the economy. So in South Africa, I think like in most other third world countries, we just have to sit tight and bear the consequences over the next 2 to 3 months. Let me move on to politics, because part of, again, what happens in these instances is that the political consequences of what happens during these extreme events stays with you for a very long time afterwards. So one of the things that happen is that you get potentially more radical outcomes politically than you do in normal times. So the extreme events sometimes lead to extreme consequences. So what I want to do is I want to focus on Cyril Ramaphosa. He is the president of South Africa and is by far the most important role player for us at the moment. There you see a photograph of him with Mandela shortly after Mandela's release. And as you can see, he was Mandela's favorite successor. Mandela was unable to engineer his succession. And Cyril actually, interestingly enough, was sidelined because he had offended the Women's League and the Youth League. So when Peter Mokaba and Winnie Mandela voted against him for Thabo Mbeki, that meant Thabo Mbeki became the successor. So what happened after the first 5 years of Mandela's rule is we actually had Thabo Mbeki become the successor, and there are certain echoes that we still see of Thabo Mbeki's rule. And so the first thing that we've got to say about Mbeki is that there were 3 parts to his legacy. The one part to his legacy is he had an Africanist approach, meaning that he wanted to promote black people, and he also took the view that anybody can do any job as long as their politics are correct. So he started promoting people who were not necessarily qualified for the specific job they were being put into, and that has had a very negative influence on the South African situation over time. So what you see is the start of the spread of incompetence. And it doesn't have to do with the color of or the origin of the people appointed. It has to do with the fact that they are appointed for political reasons rather than for reasons of competence. So incompetence starting to spread. That was point number 1. Point number 2 is he was a proponent of the developmental state. Now, it's interesting that when we're talking about what happens after the COVID epidemic, you are hearing echoes of the developmental state again coming to the fore. So if you think about the debate within the ANC, the debate within the ANC was very much along the lines of, do we actually move to socialism? Because remember that the ANC in exile was supported by the communist countries, and there's a long history of people being trained in socialism and socialist rhetoric. So you would often find ANC officials, for instance, quoting Lenin as part of their rhetoric. So there was the question of, do we move on and make South Africa a socialist country, or do we have some more moderate position? And Mbeki was a proponent of the fact that the position should be more moderate, and that more moderate position was that the government although it doesn't dominate and own everything, it should provide guidance, and you should have something called the developmental state. The government should take action to make sure that we have a more fair distribution of wealth, that we have more development of those who are underdeveloped, and that we have that the economy in general moves to become more inclusive than it was before. So if you're listening to the debates at the moment, you will see the resurrection of the idea of a developmental state. And the one half of it says there should be radical transformation. The other half says government shouldn't own everything, but it should provide strong guidance. The other legacy that we are seeing currently of Mbeki is that he was a denialist in terms of AIDS. And one of the people dealing with his denialism as the MEC for Health in KwaZulu-Natal, where the AIDS epidemic was centered, was a person called Zweli Mkhize, a medical doctor, who was extremely upset by Mbeki's denial of the fact that HIV had caused AIDS and that AIDS was causing massive damage and that this should be treated with antiretroviral medicines. So what you see is that this person who stood up against Thabo Mbeki is now today the Minister of Health. So a well-known politician, but also someone who comes out of the history of the struggle against the denial of science. So the last thing that Mkhize will be found doing is to ignore the science and to not take strong action against an epidemic. So I think that what we've got to do is we've got to say that within the ANC, there are now a large number of people also within the community advising the Minister of Health. We've got a strong representation of the people who are prominent in the fight against HIV and AIDS and who had to fight against the denialism created by Mbeki. So if we see a very strong response from the authorities against this, you've got to understand that it's also a part of the history, and it's probably an overreaction. But yes, you see the effects very long-lasting. Even 10 years after Mbeki's presidency, the effects of what he did is still with us, both in terms of things like Eskom's incompetence and in terms of the overreaction to the epidemic currently. I'd like to move on to something more recent, and the more recent thing that we're still dealing with very much is the influence of populism in the South African political scene. Now, what I'd like to do is to just take the allegory of Venezuela. So there you see Hugo Chavez, the former president of Venezuela, who came to power as an elected official. Interesting that a lot of dictators over the years have came to power for the first time in terms of being elected, Adolf Hitler among them. But Chavez was elected, and he then became president, and he started ruling in a very populist way. So what was the populist measures he took? So on the one hand, he appointed a lot of people to the government, into the civil service, and into the state-owned enterprises, and gave them nice salaries in order to shore up his support base. Now you can see why I'm using Chavez as my example. If you look at the rule of Jacob Zuma, you actually see that exact same thing. But the second thing he did is he sent a couple of his close buddies to be in charge of the biggest energy firm in the country. In the case of Hugo Chavez, that was the National Oil Company, In terms of Zuma, obviously, Eskom. And those people had two characteristics. The first is that they participated in basically corrupt activities, stealing from those firms. But secondly, they were so incompetent in Venezuela's case that they actually couldn't eventually pump enough oil anymore. So they were incompetent as well as dishonest. So if you look at the Zuma presidency, we see the appointment of a massive number of incompetent people who helped to steal at places like Eskom, SAA, and Praza, etc., etc., etc. So there is a well-known progression to the populist project, and that progression is not necessarily in favor of the general population. It's in favor of a small number of people around the president. And the last stage of that progression is that when all that there is to steal at these state-owned enterprises has been taken, and those things are essentially bankrupt, or in debt rescue, if you like to use that example, then you start printing money. So what you do is you just continue to spend state money, and the central bank merely prints the money for the government to spend. And that part of the project then leads to a massive depreciation in your exchange rate and the occurrence of hyperinflation. Now, in Venezuela, you've seen that in Zimbabwe, etc. But what happens in virtually all of those countries is that you then have an official exchange rate at which the people close to the president get their foreign exchange, and you have a black market rate at which everybody else has to deal, which is orders of magnitude, like around about 1,000 times weaker. So what you see is that there's a general deterioration in the standard of living, massive suffering because of the hyperinflation, but the ruling elite actually still lives in great comfort. Now, in South Africa, that project was interrupted by Jacob Zuma being sidelined in a process where there was actually quite a prominent faction of the ANC present in terms of the so-called Premier League. So during Zuma's presidency, there were 3 premiers of provinces who built up their political base during this period. So you see there Ace Magashila, Didi Mabuza, and Suprema Hulopela. So those 3 were very influential in getting the successor to Jacob Zuma elected. Now, we all know the history. The state capture faction, if you like, or the Zuma faction, nominated Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who, by the way, is not known to be corrupt. There are people who think that she's in cahoots with the cigarette smugglers. My personal opinion, and I've got a lot of people who differ from me, is that she's just a doctor who's very, very opposed to smoking in principle. But they nominated her to be the candidate, and she wasn't a very good candidate because she's not very well spoken. And we've seen plenty of that on our TV screens over the last month or 2. But the better candidate actually won out, and the conclusion among the cadres in the ANC was, in order to get more than 50% in the 2019 elections, which was an important goal for them, they needed a more popular leader among the normal rank and file. Again, the interesting thing is the normal rank and file in the ANC voted for Cyril Ramaphosa to become the next president of the ANC. But when it came to the conference, there wasn't a majority for Ramaphosa until Mabuza decided. to throw his weight behind Ramaphosa. And what Mabuza had done very cleverly is he had used the proceeds of his influence in Mpumalanga not only to enrich himself, but in order to sign up a large number of members for the Mpumalanga ANC, which meant that the Mpumalanga ANC had power way beyond the normal influence of Mpumalanga in South African politics. And when he started to back Ramaphosa, Ramaphosa was elected as the president, but he was elected as the deputy president of the ANC and was then in a position to insist that he also become the deputy president of the country. Now we see even today that there is that Ace Magashule, of course, became the Secretary General of the ANC, and he's still very influential in the party. Now, Ramaphosa needed to turn around the populist project that had been run by Zuma and his cronies. So effectively, before we could get to the point where the project has come to proper fulfillment, and we got to the point where the Reserve Bank was printing a lot of money and we had hyperinflation, etc. Ramaphosa came to power, but it wasn't unfettered power, but he did have the ability to appoint quite a few important people. Most of them, interestingly enough, he didn't just directly appoint. He appointed committees to advise him, and then on their advice, appointed the people. So you see there, Batoyi being appointed as the new head of the NPA, which obviously means that effectively we do need to prosecute the perpetrators of state capture. So we've seen no one being locked up for state capture yet, but we've seen Batoyi, and she's actually appointed 2 senior counsel as her deputies very recently. Actually, the president appointed them. So a strong appointment of someone who is a strong anti-corruption campaigner in the first place. Secondly, we've seen him appoint people to the major economic posts. The first one, also very important, is someone at SARS who will make sure that that tax collection gets back to the top of the agenda, and that the important people in the government also pay the taxes due. So part of the rumors that we hear is that Zuma wasn't actually very meticulous in terms of paying his own taxes. So Kisveta, again, well known as someone who will be a very strong proponent of getting the proper tax income back. And then in the important economic posts, Ramaphosa was again able to appoint to the important places which had not been captured in the state capture project. So 2 places had not been captured. The one was Treasury, except for a brief weekend when Des van Rooyen became the Minister of Finance, and also the South African Reserve Bank had not been captured. So at the Reserve Bank, we see a dyed-in-the-wool central banker being reappointed with 2 strong deputies being reappointed for 5-year terms, and Tito Mboweni, a well-known hardliner on economic affairs, meaning hardline conventional economic policy, being appointed as the Minister of Finance. So even though Cyril wasn't able to appoint whoever he liked, he could appoint a few key people who could arrest or turn around the process of state capture. So what is the current state of play? We can basically go back to the situation as it stands before the coronavirus hit us. And that is the normal situation, that the actual government of South Africa is in the hands of the ANC NEC. Now, these three-letter acronyms, ANC, African National Congress, NEC is the National Executive Committee. So those are 40 people elected at the conference, which is the ultimate authority until the next conference. So the NEC of the ANC is the real government of the country, and it deploys and undeploys presidents. So for any president of the country, if you have the support of the NEC, you can govern. If you don't have the support of the NEC, you are powerless for all practical purposes. So the NEC, by the way, undeployed Mbeki as president and undeployed Zuma as president as well. So it's well known that the ANC, the NEC is the ultimate seat of power in the South African context. And what we hear is that on the NEC there are now three factions. So the one faction is the old guard, if you like, the state capture faction, headed by Ace Magashule, including Didi Mabuza to some extent, although he seems to be on Didi Mabuza's side more than anything else. The second faction is the Cyril faction, so let's just say the conservative developmental state proponents, so Cyril and people like Mboweni would be in that category. And then thirdly, you've got the Communist Party and COSATU. So for the moment, the Communist Party and COSATU is backing Cyril against the state capture faction, and therefore he has a majority in the NEC, as long as he does not offend the interest of the unions. Now that's a big problem, because a part of what needs to be undone in South Africa is the part of the populist project under Zuma, where a large number of people were appointed to state-owned enterprises, places like SAA and Eskom. So both of those are significantly overstaffed. Also, the civil service is significantly overstaffed and overpaid. But turning that around is extremely difficult without offending the labor movement. So what you would often hear is some kind of announcement about Eskom that says it's going to be restructured and a lot of people will be retrenched. And then within a day or two, the Minister of State Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, would come on and say, no, there was a mistake. There will be restructuring, but no one will be retrenched, because they cannot actually offend labor too much in this process. So the great problem they have in terms of the state-owned enterprises is, how do you restructure these state-owned enterprises without offending labor? Now, the first thing you have to do is you've got to appoint people who are competent to head up those. And there's every indication, at least, that the people being appointed to those state enterprises are now there for their competency rather than their political loyalty. So that's a big step forward. But at the same time, they are not at liberty to restructure as they would wish, just because labor cannot be offended too much in this whole process. So that's where we stand when the coronavirus comes upon us, and we have a state of what is it called? It's not the state of emergency. It's the lockdown is instituted, but in the lockdown, there's then a new authority created, the Coronavirus Command Council. And the Coronavirus Command Council is not an open, transparent arm of the government where there's any kind of oversight. It's something that's so secretive that we do not even know its composition, even now. The rumors we hear is that it started out being the cabinet and a portion of the cabinet and a portion of the directors general, and that it now includes the whole of the cabinet and all of the directors general. So, and kind of an unwieldy body already. But in terms of the lockdown regulations, a lot of the implementation goes to a lady called Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who was previously the Minister of Health, who's a medical doctor and well known to be highly opposed to smoking. So she was actually the person, when she was Minister of Health under Mandela, who instituted the ban on cigarette advertising. So a long history of anti-smoking. So what happens is we become the only country in the world where we ban smoking and the sale of alcohol during the lockdown. And what starts to happen is that even though there's a strong political support initially for the lockdown, because people are supportive of protecting the health of the economy, we then see that during the lockdown, there's a very prominent role played up by Dlamini-Zuma, also by Zweli Mkhize, and that a lot of regulations are promulgated that can at best be described as somewhat random. But effectively, we now get to a point where we're in a situation where lockdown regulations are being promulgated and implemented in a way that is not always transparent and always democratic. So very good to see, first of all, that the courts have ruled that there should be at least as much oversight as in state of emergency over these things. So the courts have not been captured, and the courts are still prepared to rule against the government that be. But there are three things that have stood out for me during the lockdown. The first conclusion that I've come to during the lockdown is that Cyril Ramaphosa clearly is not in full control. Now, these things have vacillated a little bit. There was the incident where the president announced that smoking, the sale of cigarettes would be allowed, and that was reversed by Dlamini-Zuma. So the optics on that was not very good. And he didn't really support the idea that Ramaphosa was in full charge. Then there was the incident where the president said that the country would go to level 3, and then on the very next day, Zweli Mkhize actually said that large parts of the country would actually stay in stage 4. In this case, Mkhize was forced to retract, and the whole country luckily went to level 3, because we clearly at the point where the damage to the South African economy is such that we can't sustain the level 4 for much longer. But there was also interesting, the language over time changed. Roughly during the middle of the lockdown, everything was attributed to the Coronavirus Command Council. When Ramaphosa announced that the country was going to level 3, he said that had been a cabinet decision. So there seems to be some vacillation. But clearly Ramaphosa is not in full control, but on the other hand, he's not powerless either. So the power battle within the ANC certainly continues to happen. So that's point number one. Interestingly enough, the polls that we see coming out says that Ramaphosa still has very strong support among the general population, but that Dlamini-Zuma's trust level among ordinary people has become quite low. So actually, in terms of political support, it seems like Ramaphosa has come out the better of the two. The next question that strikes me under the lockdown is the level of incompetency. So there's massive incompetency coming right from very close to the top. So Ramaphosa seems to be quite competent. Mkhize actually seems to be quite competent. But the moment things move on from there, you get completely senseless regulations being promulgated. So exercise between 6 and 9 in the morning. What part of, if you force people to exercise at the same time, you actually undermine social distancing? Do these people not understand? So a very high level of incompetency from the cabinet right through to the policeman on the street who is being way too aggressive towards the general public. So a very high level of incompetency, first of all. And the third thing is a quite strong authoritarian streak coming to the fore, meaning we will tell you where to exercise. We will impose various restrictions on the sale of alcohol, on the sale of cigarettes, etc., and you will do so because we say so. So the authoritarian streak in the ANC strongly coming forward. There seems towards the end to be some level of pushback against this authoritarian streak, and it looks like the more moderate faction in the ANC winning out in terms of the move to level 3. But the still a very strong political battle being waged, and in that political battle, we've got to keep in mind that the eventual outcome in the next election can go one of a couple of ways. The one thing is, it's clear that if the ANC were to retain Ramaphosa, it is likely to retain more than 50% of the popular vote, and therefore it will continue to govern. So there's a strong incentive for the ANC to retain Ramaphosa in general. However, if Ramaphosa was sidelined, and again, you heard some of those rumors that Ramaphosa would be sidelined and Dlamini Zuma would be promoted to president, etc., during the lockdown period. Those rumors seem to have passed us by now. But if Ramaphosa was to be sidelined, or if something was to happen to him health-wise, then in the next election, it's very likely that the ANC would not be elected with more than a 50% majority, and that would push us into the realms of coalition politics. And if we now go to the potential coalition partners, the first potential coalition partner for the moderate faction of the ANC would be the DA. Although, given that Helen Zille and John Steenhuisen is now in charge of the DA seems to be intent on solidifying its white support base against the Freedom Front, against which they had lost quite a lot of support in the last election, rather than to continue their project of trying to push forward a black leader and try to get black support. So something that would be a difficult partner for any faction of the ANC, but the logical partner for the more moderate portion of the ANC. The other potential partner, of course, becomes the EFF with Julius Malema, ex-ANC, and they would be the logical partner for the more radical wing. So the nightmare scenario for South Africa is a split in the ANC, where the moderate faction gets sidelined and the ANC allies with the EFF to govern. So populism back to the fore, and I would say very much the more radical economic measures that would signal a very bad outcome. Interestingly enough, the first time that Ace Magashula got his hands on the press release of the NEC, he said that the NEC had decided that the Reserve Bank should have quantity easing, meaning they should start printing money. Didn't even get the economic term right, but nevertheless, he understands what he means, and that is he wants the Reserve Bank to print money. So the question for us is, does Cyril win out? And the strategy, the path for him to win out would be to say that actually Batoyi succeeds in prosecuting some of the state capture faction, and the state capture faction gets sidelined, and Ramaphosa serves a second 5-year term, but this time fully in charge rather than constrained within the NEC. So that's the one possibility. The other possibility is that there's a split in the ANC and that you get a realignment of politics around two broad coalition factions, the one being the moderate portion of the ANC allied to basically the DA, and the EFF allied to the less moderate portion, and it's not clear which of those would win out. The one thing I would say just about the current circumstances is that it's clear that the EFF has nailed their mask to the lockdown. So what they're saying is the lives of people should be protected, and that if there's now a massive health crisis, they will actually ascribe that health crisis to Cyril and the ANC for opening up too quickly, actually. So although the DA is pushing for an opening up, which you could understand because a large part of their support base are small business owners, which have been the worst affected people in this whole scenario. The EFF, interestingly enough, is not supporting fast opening up. It's actually supporting the lockdown. But what we can see is that the whole lockdown area can lead to more radical results. So we're already seeing a very strong debate about what the economic restructuring of South Africa would be, with some factions pushing for things like wealth taxes and a radical restructuring towards a stronger BEE. But with another faction saying, no, we actually need to restructure in such a way that we have effective state-owned enterprises that can function and be part of the solution in South Africa. And that probably means that you've got to introduce private sector shareholding into that, meaning it's clear that Telkom, for instance, functioned a lot better than Eskom. And the reason for that is that corporate governance was a lot better because there were private sector shareholding involved in Telkom. So there's rumors that, for instance, the government wants to now merge ComAir with SAA and introduce the private sector element into the SAA environment, which would give them better governance. So there are opposing forces, and it's not clear who will win out. But the underlying popularity that Ramaphosa has gained will stand in good stead. So not clear that he will come out of this weaker than he had been before. So with that, I'm going to stand pat on the South African political situation. So let's live and see, and hope that the economy actually picks up even while we see a significant worsening of the health situation. So it will be very interesting to see how the government handles the health situation and whether they go back into stricter lockdown as the health situation worsens. Unfortunately, that wouldn't necessarily be very helpful, but it is the instinct of governments to want to lock down more when health deteriorates. So much for South African politics then. Let me move on then to what's happening in the wider world, to the world economy and to world markets. Please. So the first thing that we've got to say about the global situation is that we saw a meltdown of the real economy in terms that we've never seen before in world history. So as the United States, which is still the most influential economy in the world, so the old saying is that when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches pneumonia. There's still some element of truth to that, although I guess we need new metaphors in the age of COVID. What we see during the lockdown is that employment drops massively in the United States. So there you see the statistic, the real-time statistic that we can measure very quickly is the new claims for unemployment insurance by workers in the United States. And what you see is a measure that has never really gone above 500,000. Suddenly you get 3.3 million people applying for unemployment insurance, and the next week 6.8 million people join them. And we see that the new weekly unemployment claims are still being measured in the millions, even though it has come down. So effectively what this tells us is we are probably sitting in the United States with an unemployment rate somewhere between 20 and 25%. Now, the last time that we saw that was in the Great Depression. So a massive, massive impact on the economy. What we see then is that as this impact comes in, we also see some reaction from the authorities to ameliorate that. But effectively, we see something that is the other way around from what we normally see. Normally, we see problems occurring in the financial sector, in the credit markets or in the stock markets, and that's spilling over into the real economy. In this case, we're seeing the real economy being the origin of the issues. And what we see is then that there's a very interesting reaction in stock markets. So as the stock markets come to realize how the extent of the problems in the real economy, you see an initial very sharp fall in the stock market, meaning traditionally a bear market is defined as a 20% fall in the market. In this case, we see a fall of roughly 35% in the market, very, very rapidly. But the market then turning around on a dime and actually going back up to roughly the same level it had been at in 2018. So still not quite at the peak where it was before, but really a mild correction in the stock market if we go from the top to where it is now, rather than a serious bear market. So the question for us at this stage is that it? Have we seen the V-shaped event in stock markets, and we see a V-shaped event in the economy as well? Or is the trouble more long-lasting, and is there another down leg to come in the bear market? So interestingly enough, from the bottom point to where we are now is more than a 20% rise. So that already complies with the popular definition of a bull market. Now, I'll quickly relate to you a conversation I had with a small business owner very recently, and he said to me, well, I see that people are expecting a V-shaped recovery, but it seems to him that if someone takes a stiletto and pushes it through your ribs into your lung, if that stiletto is removed, are you then back to rude health? And the answer is surely not. And effectively what he says is, I'm running a small restaurant. The first thing I will say to you is I was due for a refurbishment of my restaurant before the problems arose. I've cancelled all refurbishment orders because I don't have cash anymore to spend on refurbishment, meaning that his own confidence in investing into his business has been shattered. So that's point number one. That effect will be long-lasting. So his own thing is, everybody is very keen to lend me money, but I don't know how I will ever repay that money because I have, while sitting at home with my kids, I've slowly gone bankrupt. So effectively, the owner's equity that he had accumulated over many years has been wiped out in the 2 months. that his business has had to be closed. So that roughly tells you where businesses are. The other thing he says is, I understand that I'm only going to bring back 80% of my staff. I cannot afford to reappoint all my staff that I had before, because I'm also very confident that a lot of people will not come back and buy food from me anymore because they won't be able to afford it. So a large number of people who have not been able to work will not be able to buy my product anymore, and therefore my turnover is likely to be at least 20% lower once the whole thing has passed. So effectively, that talks to the second leg of this, and that is consumer confidence. So consumers will fall out into roughly three categories in the same way that businesses do. One category of people are the people who are still fully paid but have now been sitting at home and not spending the normal amount on things like eating out, traveling, etc. Those people will have some additional money to spend. A very interesting observation is that government employees and politicians all fall into this category. So government employees on the whole have been reluctant to return to work because they are not feeling any pain from the lockdown, in the sense that they are being fully paid as we speak. The people who are feeling the pain are the people who have been retrenched or have been put on reduced pay in the private sector. So the private sector, and especially the smaller enterprises in the private sector, is where the pain has been extremely prominent. So the second portion of people are the people who have retained their jobs but actually have had reduced salaries and are therefore under some kind of financial strain, or have only had to not be at work for a small period of time. So taking some financial strain, but very quickly having an income again. And then the third category of people are those people who have lost their jobs and whose jobs have not come back and will not quickly come back. And those people will take a very long time before they participate as consumers again. But what it says is that roughly 70% of consumers will want to rebuild their balance sheets before they spend freely again. So in essence, both consumers and businesses will be extremely keen to return to activity as producers, but not as consumers. And we're also seeing this in the Chinese factories. When they open up again, they start producing again fairly quickly, but then they find that they've got no customers. And in the Western world, production will lag because companies will not produce unless they see demand for their products. And then the third thing that we're seeing is that there's also a growing reluctance from governments to spend money because they see that their own balance sheets have been seriously affected. So in South Africa, just to give you an indication, when Jacob Zuma became president, the government, the debt of the South African government was about 20% of GDP. During the 9 years of his rule, it actually grew to about 55% of GDP. We were likely to go to 60% of GDP within the next year or so under the pre-COVID budgets. In terms of the current situation, it looks likely that we're going to go to 100% of GDP of debt within the next 2 years. So in essence, the same damage that 10 years of Zuma rule inflicted will be inflicted in 2 years by the coronavirus. So governments will also have to fix their own balance sheets and reduce their own debt levels. So their own ability, especially in developing economies, to support the economies will be limited. So what we actually see is some difficulty in a return to normality. Maybe while we're at it then, on the global scene, what we're seeing is two things playing out at the same time. The one thing is that In developing countries, we are now seeing a massive expansion of the epidemic. So you're seeing that Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, and so on, the whole of Latin America is having a phenomenal epidemic because they actually can't afford a strict lockdown and they don't have the ability to lock down strictly. So a massive epidemic happening in those countries. At the same time, you're also seeing a massive epidemic in places like Indonesia and India. So very, very widespread, very intense epidemic happening as we speak in developing countries. But what that means is that those countries will then actually move towards some form of herd immunity in a couple of months. So by the end of the year, you will have seen developing countries on the whole putting the epidemic behind them because a large portion of their populations would have been affected, and there would be a large portion of immunity being developed in those communities. So that's the one thing that we see. From an economic point of view, there seems to be a general recognition in those countries that they cannot sustain a strict lockdown, and even a country like India that had a very strict initial lockdown, easing that lockdown significantly, South Africa falling into that category. So moving away from lockdown, but being highly affected by the illness. The other thing we're seeing is we're seeing lockdown fatigue in developed countries. So we're seeing that in Europe, most countries, places like Spain, Italy, Germany, are moving on from their lockdowns. But even a country like Britain, where there's still a very large number of infections, also starting to move on from their lockdown. So there seems to be a large amount of lockdown fatigue, and it may be that some of these countries are moving too early for developed countries to move along, and that they will see a strong recurrence, and they will eventually end up being more like developing countries in terms of the way they've handled the pandemic. And the one country that falls into that category is the United States. Because in the United States, President Trump seems to have made the decision after a brief moment of treating the virus very seriously. He seems to have come to the conclusion that his chances of re-election, if the country is still in some form of lockdown by November, is very small. So he is promoting a very rapid opening up of the US economy, and is even ridiculing cheap measures to contain the virus, such as the wearing of masks. So in the US, we're now seeing a premature opening up in many states. So in some states like New York, the governors are in control and they've had the epidemic and it's moving on. But what we're seeing in the US now, if you look at the graph of new cases in the US, it'll come up in a second. There we go. You see that the cases in general, the new cases, are on a downward trend, but there's still a very large number of new cases being reported in the US. And if you break it down, there are 22 states in the US where new cases are still rising. So the coronavirus doesn't spread evenly. So even in South Africa, you see most of the cases in the Western Cape for the moment. It will spread to other parts of the country soon. But what you see then in the US is that they're opening up before they've really brought the virus under control. So if you want to look at what China did, what you see in China, and again, there's some debate about the accuracy of Chinese records and publications on this, but what you see in China is that they had a spike in cases. They locked down very seriously, and then they brought the new cases to 0 and kept it there for a couple of weeks before they started opening up. So in essence, what you've got in a place like China is you testing and tracking and tracing all new cases and keeping the virus out of your economy completely. You see a similar thing in New Zealand. So now New Zealand is a country that locked down very early, didn't really get an epidemic, and we've now had 5 days without new cases in New Zealand. So New Zealand will probably open up and have rugby with spectators very soon, because they've brought the epidemic under control. But it looks like in the US they've abandoned the idea of bringing the epidemic under control, or the virus under control fully, which is something that you would expect of a developed country. And they are opening up in spite of the fact that there's still a lot of cases around, and they're prioritizing opening the economy over saving lives. Now, again, that makes sense in developing countries, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in a country like the US, but that's what we're seeing. So what we're likely to see is a strong continuation of the illness in the US over the next couple of months because of the opening up. And it will be very interesting to see whether local governments, like governors of specific states, move to lock down again, because there's a very strong inclination in places where your health system gets overwhelmed. There's a very strong inclination to lock down again. So in the US, we could very well see a renewed lockdown, and in fact, Britain falls into that same category. Then the last thing I want to focus on is on the whole question of what's happening in markets. And one of the things that you have to say in markets is, why is it that we are seeing such a massive impact on the economy, and we haven't seen the statistics coming out for the second quarter of the year yet? We've only seen statistics for the first quarter. But even for the first quarter, you get numbers in certain countries coming out like a contraction of 7% in the economy. So we actually expect a contraction of 20% or more in most developed countries for the second quarter. So a massive effect in the real economy, but a very small effect in the in markets. And the main reason for this seems to be the intervention of the authorities in the money market. So the center of the global financial system is the US Federal Reserve. And here you can see what the US Federal Reserve has done over the last couple of years. So you see that in the mid-10s, meaning roughly from 2012 onwards, they had a period of so-called quantitative easing, where they tried to stimulate the economy by buying US government bonds and thereby pushing interest rates, especially longer-term rates, down, and thereby trying to stimulate the economy. So you can see that the response now is orders of magnitude larger. So the amount of liquidity introduced into the system when the stock market started falling by the Federal Reserve was massive and very rapid. So you can see trillions of dollars of new money being created. Now that new money, to some extent, one of the major red lines that was crossed by the Federal Reserve is they started buying not only US government securities, but they started buying debt instruments issued by private companies. Therefore, and they often did it through the buying of exchange-traded funds. So they would come in and buy up to BBB securities issued by companies in the US. So in essence, if you think about it, there was a great deal of worry in the US system initially as markets started to tumble, that companies would not be able to survive because they just won't have the liquidity, and that the confidence in the debt markets will be undermined. Now remember that in the US, most companies don't borrow from banks the way they do in Europe or in South Africa. They borrow directly from markets. So what normally happens is that central banks would put money into the banking system, and the banks would put that money into companies. In this case, the Federal Reserve bypassed the banks and started buying debt directly from companies. And that has had a massive positive impact on the stock market, because effectively what it said is that large listed companies will not fail during this epidemic because they will be able to raise debt very easily. Now, what we have to keep in mind, though, is that what the Federal Reserve does is still to issue or to buy debt, meaning those companies who have now placed debt instruments with the Federal Reserve will still have to repay that debt at some point in the future. So when we're thinking about the future, this instrument may not be adequate. So let's have a quick look at the basic monetary policy situation as it stood even before we got into this mess, if you like. And what you see is that during the, we'll see it in a couple of seconds, I would hope. The adoption of new technology during this whole thing has been phenomenal, but the systems are not always quick to respond. So what you see there is that if you look at the amount of easing that happened after the credit crunch in 2008, you see that interest rates came down from roughly 5.25% to about 0.25% very rapidly. So an easing of 5% in interest rates. And that wasn't enough, and that led to the quantitative easing that we saw during the from 2012 onwards. Quantitative easing was added to those falling interest rates. Now, what we see is that interest rates in the last cycle went up gradually and peaked at about 2.5%. So when the crisis struck, in fact, interest rates were already falling, and interest rates were slightly less than 2% already, and that those were very quickly taken down to zero. So we're back at roughly zero for interest rates, but that's only a fall from the top of 2.5%. So that's not nearly enough to stimulate the economy in a normal recession. So the first debate is, are we going to see a recession in the aftermath of the epidemic? So let's just quickly go back to when does the epidemic end? The first stage of the economic reaction to the epidemic or the pandemic is lockdown. For most developed countries, lockdown is now behind us or will be behind us soon. So roughly the second quarter of 2020 is the strict lockdown quarter. And during that period, the economy's probably lost in the order of between 25 and 35% of production was lost during that period. Obviously concentrated in some sectors. So sectors like flying, restaurants, tourism, and so on being much worse affected than others. But then you go into the second stage of the problem, and the second stage is the stage during which you go beyond the lockdown, the strict lockdown, but you still have a lot of restrictions in place. And the challenges that businesses then face is, first of all, that some of them may not be open yet, meaning tourism, flying, restaurants, etc. Not only in South Africa, but worldwide, those things are not being allowed to open on the whole. The other thing that actually falls into that is doctors. Very few doctors are actually operating at full capacity because people are extremely reluctant to visit hospitals, and they're not actually operating at full capacity. But so that's actually a sign of the lack of demand. So as businesses come back, even those who are allowed to come back may not find enough demand for all they can produce. And then the third difficulty they face is they must now produce while having social distancing in place. So that means they've got to screen workers, they've got to provide protective equipment, they can't actually run full shifts, they've got to keep people separate from each other, etc. So those demands of social distancing will probably introduce a large amount of inefficiency into the production process. So it's not only demand, but also production that gets disrupted. And the other thing that businesses, especially in places like South Africa, India, Brazil, Mexico, developing countries will face is that they will have illness in their workforce over the next 3 months. So a lot of workers actually won't pitch up, some of them because they are nervous about the fact that they might get ill, but others might not pitch up because they are ill. So actually one of the things we see in hospitals is that large number of hospital staff gets infected and then don't pitch at work, so that puts more pressure on the remaining hospital staff. So, so quite a few problems faced during this phase by businesses. This phase only ends when we get either a vaccine or a very effective medical treatment for the COVID space. The first thing we've got to say is there's been some medicines touted that turns out not to be highly effective. So there's not really a treatment that we know of that is extremely effective for the illness. So that's not really on the cards at the moment, although a lot of existing medicines are being tested to see whether they work. Hydroxychloroquine, for instance, is apparently being tested on the American president. But what we see is that where it's being formally tested in scientific circumstances, it actually worsens the illness. So those experiments are being terminated. Then what we see is that there are a massive attempt to develop a vaccine for this, and those attempts are progressing well. So there are a number of vaccine candidates that's already going into human trials, which indicates that we may see an effective vaccine towards the end of the year. Because these things take a long time to be trialed to make sure that it's safe, because if you're going to give a vaccine to a couple of billion people, you better be fairly sure that it's safe before you start. So vaccine availability probably starting towards the end of the year, but really not being widely available around the world before roughly the middle of next year. So we are going to be in some form of this 90% economy for another 6 months to a year. And our estimate is that what you see in that environment is you start out, you gradually go from losing about 30% of GDP to losing about 10% of GDP. So under level 3 lockdown, we'd probably go back to about 90% of the production we had before lockdown started in terms of productive capability. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. It will take us a while to ramp up. So it probably doesn't ramp up back to that before probably about August, if we look at it. So in most countries, the 90% economy takes hold in around about August of this year. And then we stay in that for another at least 6 months. So it's very likely that during that period, you will see a further deterioration of the balance sheets of individuals and companies. And the question for economists is really, to some extent, to say, okay, is this a V-shaped event? The epidemic, meaning it's a virus that comes along, we conquer the virus, we move past the epidemic and we go back to where we were before very rapidly. The other possibility, economists talk about your U-shaped recovery, meaning you go back down, you stay at the bottom for a fairly long time, and then you gradually, then you have a fairly sharp recovery. The third possibility is an L-shaped recovery, meaning you drop off the cliff and you stay at the bottom. And then you've got what people would call a double dip recession or a W-shaped event, meaning you get a quick recovery, but you then sink back into recession and that you then eventually recover. It's interesting that if you look at the comments of people around this, most serious economists who do not work for merchant banks or not involved in the stock markets basically are extremely worried about the ability of the world to recover from this. And they basically think that we'll get back to where we were before, somewhere between 2023 and 2025. So a fairly long period of recession followed by a fairly slow recovery. So a fairly quick recovery from the 70% down to the 10% down, but then a very slow recovery from the 10% down back to 100% economy. So the 100% economy probably somewhere between 2023 and 2025 only. The other part of that is that a lot of the commentators talking about it from the market point of view are very optimistic that this is V-shaped. We get back to production very quickly, and this is also something promoted by Donald Trump as part of his re-election campaign. We'll get our economy back up and running very quickly after this, and we just have to go beyond the fear stoked by the virus. That's not really how we see things. We think that there's a long, slow recovery, and it's very difficult for us to get out of this. The one last thing I'd want to just quickly comment on was that one of the effects when markets started falling and liquidity started getting constrained, the part of the world that was not bailed out by the Federal Reserve were emerging market currencies. So emerging market currencies took a huge amount of strain, and with that strain on emerging market currencies, there was also massive strain on the bonds issued by those emerging markets. So what you saw in a place like South Africa is the currency went all the way to 19 to the dollar, and that we actually saw long rates in South Africa rise significantly at the same time that short rates were falling. So a very pronounced steepening of the yield curve. We think that's an interim phenomenon. We don't think that emerging markets are significantly worse affected eventually by this event than developed countries. We think that the recovery process is different, but not worse. So we think that there's no reason for the rand, for instance, to be weaker because of this permanently. So we think that rand goes back to a normal range. Now, the normal range for the rand centers around the 1450 level. So not that we think that it goes back there quickly, but we've already seen it come back from 19 rand to the dollar to around 17 rand 50. So a very significant strengthening in the rand already. And we think that that strengthening in the rand should continue, and that we should fairly quickly see the rand go back to the 15 to 16 level at the least. And we've also seen long rates in South Africa start to fall. So we still think there's an opportunity in terms of long South African government bonds. If you're exposed to South African government bonds, you're likely to see a nice profit over the next 6 months to a year, maybe even 2 years. So that's a part of the markets that we're quite positive about. In general, though, what we would say is the stock markets worldwide are very close, or much too close, to where they were before this problem started. So before the COVID thing came along, markets were already extended in terms of their valuations. So what we think is that at this point, stock markets are actually quite high, and there's a massive risk that they could come down a lot more. And we think that the risk-return combination in stock markets is unattractive in the sense that the upside in markets is limited, whereas the downside is significant. So if we just look at the level of markets, we think that they're not very attractive. At the same time, though, calm has returned to the markets. So in the dynamic parity portfolio, where many of our clients are exposed, they look very closely at volatility. So when volatility spiked early in March, they exited the markets, which meant they didn't participate in the 35% fall in stock markets. But at the same time, they were then not in for the rapid up initially. But as volatility has faded, the rules have given them the signals to get back into the market. So they have about 40% of maximum exposure at this point. So they are participating. But again, what they would say is that if markets were to go down again, it would be preceded mostly by a spike in volatility, and they will exit the markets again at that point. But in general, stock markets don't look very attractive to us. It doesn't look like a very attractive time for us to be buying dollars. So effectively what we do is we buy dollar for our clients, but we actually hedge it back into rand so as to get the exposure to the dollar at a later stage when we think that the exchange rate will be more amenable. So in short then, we think that stock markets are overextended, but that emerging market currencies are undervalued, and that emerging market bonds are undervalued on the whole in terms of where markets are. I've used up my hour and a half, so I think I'll stand back with that. Lee, are you?
Thanks, Wikus. Yeah, I'm there, and thank you very much. Just on time, and thank you. But what I think comes out of it is more that, and hopefully you see Wikus hasn't delved too deeply into the investments, because each one of you has an individual situation. And that's why earlier I said we help people construct their lifetime flight plans. It's never too soon to look at the structure that you have, and that's where our strength is in terms of seeing where you are and then giving advice accordingly, rather than saying, look, this is a great share to buy today or sell tomorrow. We don't do that. And what it is just to say, it's never too soon to restructure, to have a look at where you are and to plan going forward. Whether it's that your will, we're having quite a few people donating money to their children right now because their children have been retrenched and are out of jobs. So all of those things relate to individual situations, which is where we come into play. But I don't know whether any of you have any specific questions right now. If you have, please raise your hand, and Wikus will do his best to answer them.
Lee, while we're giving people a chance to think about this, I think that is right. What we would normally say to people is, it's all interesting stuff, the things that are happening out there. But really what you should be doing is, what's always more important than what happens out there is, what are you doing? And it's always really important that you don't act in panic, that you act within a well thought through long-term plan. And a part of that long-term plan is to say how much money should not be exposed to markets, meaning you should always be able to work through at least a 5 or 6 year period where markets are down without touching your market exposure, so that you're never a panic seller of assets at the wrong time. So that's the first part of it. But also to say that you need to be sure that you are spending within your long-term ability. Now, one of the things that happens when you get a crisis like this is that a lot of people's balance sheets have been badly affected by this, and the affordability what is affordable to them over their lifetimes have actually been changed by this. So this businessman that I was talking about said, I never thought I'd sit in my house with my children and see myself go bankrupt. So his ability to spend money in the long run has been affected. And he needs to have another look at his long-term plan, because he needs to actually work back to his previous position slowly. It won't happen overnight. And it's very important to face reality as it is. So our advice to people is, rather than saying I'm doing nothing now because things are so uncertain, what you should do is to say, I'm reviewing my lifelong plan right now to make sure that I'm okay within the limits of this. And on the whole, I'd have to say our clients are actually fine, because they are people who have already got money and they didn't lose money through this period. So their plans are still in place. But if you're not our client yet, we'd love to have a very good look at this. And part of what we say is you need to make sure that you give yourself a lot of optionality. If you're a South African, all of these events, both political and related to the virus, make things more uncertain. So you need to be more sure that you've got the alternative to go wherever you want to be in the world if South Africa turns out not to be a good place. And that basically means you've got to have money that you can go join offshore if you want to. And also the other part of what it means is, if you're a young person, you've got to have some skills or qualifications that you can go use offshore if you need to. But it also means that calibrating your spending patterns is quite an important issue, or actually even thinking about utilizing opportunities that may come from this, because there may be bargains to be had in terms of properties or businesses or whatever. All of those things need to happen in terms of a well thought out long-term plan. So our advice to our clients and to potential clients is, let's have a look, let's sit down together, have a look at your long-term plans, and make sure that you're acting from a position of strength rather than from a panicky position of weakness at all times.
Yeah, thanks, Wikus.